The rain came down hard against the tall glass windows of Michael's office tower in Boston. Most of the upper floors were already dark by then. It was past 7, and the city outside seemed to dissolve into silver ribbons of water. Michael sat at his desk, drained from another long stretch of work. His tie hung askew around his neck. His shirt sleeves were rolled high, faint smudges of graphite and ink visible along his forearms. A thick stack of unfinished blueprints was spread across his desk, lines blurring into one another under the dull glow of his desk lamp. For weeks he'd been surviving on caffeine and the reckless adrenaline of deadlines, pushing himself further each night. Yet the finish line always seemed to move an inch farther away. The office was so quiet that even the rain began to sound like company. He rubbed his eyes and stared out the window, debating whether to call it a night when the sharp, deliberate click of heels echoed through the hallway. Michael turned toward the sound. It was Emily, the newest hire on the design team, walking in with a folder clutched against her chest. She looked genuinely surprised to find anyone still here. "You're working late too?" she asked, a faint smile cutting through the stillness. Michael offered a tired grin. "Deadlines don't recognize office hours." She gave a soft laugh and crossed the room to set the folder down on his desk. "These are the sketches you asked for. I figured I'd finish before morning chaos hit." Her voice carried that calm self-assurance that made every word sound lighter than it should have. For a brief moment, the weight pressing on Michael's shoulders seemed to ease. Their conversation began safely enough, about the project, the design pitch, the relentless schedule, but it soon drifted further. They talked about Boston's unpredictable weather, her recent move from Chicago, his favorite coffee spot near the harbor. Emily confessed she was still figuring the city out. Michael, without thinking twice, told her where to find the best croissants and the only cafe with a view good enough to quiet the mind. The exchange flowed easily, unforced, uninterrupted. It had been years since simple conversation had felt so unstrained. Years since he'd felt the spark of being seen and heard so clearly. Emily laughed at something he said, the sound soft and genuine, and he found himself drawn to her warmth, the quiet brightness in her eyes that seemed to melt through exhaustion. He leaned forward slightly, caught in her voice, forgetting the pile of work entirely. Time slipped away before either of them noticed. When Emily finally glanced at the wall clock, she blinked as if waking from a trance. "I didn't mean to keep you," she said, reaching for her umbrella. "You didn't," Michael admitted. "Honestly, this has been the best part of my day." The words came out before he could stop them. For a second, Emily held his gaze, a tiny pause, and then gave him a polite smile. "Good night, Michael." When she left, the air in the office felt different, emptier, as though her presence had carried something luminous that had now vanished. The sound of the rain filled the silence again, but now it only seemed to remind him of her laughter echoing faintly behind it. For the first time in years, he felt awake and frightened, because he knew what this meant and what it could mean. He was married. He had a wife waiting for him at home. Yet the simple exchange with Emily had stirred something he thought had vanished from his life. The drive home was slow. The streets glowed slick and metallic from the flood of headlights and rain. His mind rewound the moments of that conversation over and over. The way she smiled, her effortless ease, the closeness when she leaned forward. Guilt swelled in his chest, warring with the undeniable pleasure he felt. He tried convincing himself it was innocent. Two exhausted people simply sharing words on a late night. But underneath, some part of him already knew better. When he stepped into his house, the kitchen light was still on. Sarah stood by the counter, stirring a pot of soup. She smiled when she saw him, gentle and familiar. He hesitated before kissing her cheek. Something about that small delay felt wrong, like he was already hiding something he couldn't name. At dinner, Sarah asked the usual questions, about the project, the late hours, whether he'd finally be able to take a weekend break. Michael answered reflexively, but his thoughts were already elsewhere, orbiting around the laughter that didn't belong in that room. He caught himself comparing the warmth he had felt with Emily to the quiet, predictable rhythm of his marriage. The contrast made his stomach twist. He loved Sarah. He knew that. They'd weathered years of struggle and built a life on shared effort and quiet consistency. But as he sat there across from her, he couldn't ignore the creeping truth. Something between them had grown heavy, mechanical, faded around the edges. That night, Michael lay awake listening to the lingering rain against the roof. Each drop seemed to echo Emily's voice in his mind. He told himself it was nothing, that what he'd felt was a reaction to stress, chance chemistry. But denial didn't hold up to memory. The truth glimmered quietly. It had been more than a passing spark. It had been something he didn't expect, something both thrilling and dangerous. He didn't know it then, but that one quiet evening had opened a door he would never again be able to close. The weeks that followed that storm blurred together, but Michael felt each day grow heavier. Work, the thing that had once hollowed him out, became something he looked forward to again. Not for the projects, not for the achievements, but for her. He told himself it was harmless, that Emily was simply a colleague who happened to understand him in ways Sarah couldn't anymore. But each morning he caught himself anticipating the sound of her voice. Each afternoon, the sight of her walking into the room. When she smiled, something in his chest lifted, and when she didn't, the day felt incomplete. Their conversations deepened. They started sharing fragments of their lives that had nothing to do with architecture. Emily asked about his childhood, his early inspirations, the first time he realized he wanted to build things. Michael found himself telling stories he hadn't voiced aloud in years, stories he'd never thought to share with Sarah. Emily listened the way few people did. She remembered details. She laughed at his half-finished jokes. She sent him short, whimsical texts late at night, comments about the project, a video of the rain matching the sound he often described from his office window, little bits of her thoughts that felt tailor-made for him. At first, he ignored the buzzing phone when Sarah was near, but soon the habit formed. He became deft with excuses, checking messages in the bathroom, on the porch, quietly beside the muted television. It was innocent, he claimed to himself. Just friendly banter. But deep down, he could feel the shift. Sarah noticed it almost immediately. At dinner, her questions grew more tentative, her smiles more forced. She would reach for his hand across the table only to find him distracted, absorbed in a screen or a drifting thought. When she leaned toward him at night, he'd roll away, claiming exhaustion. She tried to pull him back, with his favorite meals, soft notes on the refrigerator door, the suggestion of a weekend getaway. Michael smiled, thanked her, but his mind was still 2 steps away, reliving the cadence of Emily's laughter. He hated what that meant, but he couldn't stop it either. The cruel truth was simple. Emily's attention fed a quiet emptiness he hadn't realized was starving. One Thursday evening, he stayed late again. The city's glow bled faintly through his window as Emily stepped in, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I figured you might need a refill," she said. He accepted it with a laugh of genuine gratitude, and they ended up side by side, heads bent close over a set of renderings. When her shoulder brushed his, neither moved. Time held its breath between them, and though nothing was said, something unmistakable passed through the air. The next morning, Sarah asked why he'd gotten in so late. He answered quickly, something about the project, a last-minute client revision. She nodded, but her eyes told him she wasn't convinced. Her voice was calm, but her worry was written beneath each silence. She didn't accuse him, but she felt it, the way love starts slipping long before proof appears. At work, Michael tried to bury himself in tasks, but Emily's presence was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, She leaned across his desk to point out an adjustment on the blueprint, her voice soft as a whisper. The scent of her perfume curled through the air, delicate and familiar. Michael looked up, and their eyes caught. No words passed. Neither needed them. The unspoken pull between them was so clear that it frightened him. He knew what should happen next. Step back, draw the boundary, remember the vows, the life waiting at home. But he didn't move. He stayed still, pulse racing, reason slipping like sand through shaking hands. He'd spent his life ruling by logic, building with precision. But here, standing inches from Emily, logic had no weight. That night, he lay awake beneath the soft rhythm of Sarah's breathing, guilt pressing into his ribs. He hated himself for the thoughts he couldn't silence, the memory of closeness that now looped endlessly in his mind. He loved his wife. He truly did, but he couldn't deny the new and dangerous longing unfurling within him. Days passed, and the space between him and Sarah turned into quiet distance. She saw the signs, the silent phone he tucked away, the faint smile whenever a message pinged. And though she never voiced her fear, she felt it growing. Meanwhile, Michael clung to the illusion of control. He told himself he could handle it, that there was still a line he hadn't crossed, but control is a fragile invention. Every laugh, every message, every meeting blurred that line further until it was little more than a fading smear on glass. And then came the night everything changed. Emily appeared in his office once more, carrying a stack of plans. The entire building was silent, emptied long ago. She leaned over his desk to show him a detail. He could smell her perfume, the faint trace of rain still clinging to her coat. Michael looked up. Really looked, and what he saw in her eyes mirrored his unspoken want exactly. The tension that had thrummed quietly for weeks snapped into plain sight. He could have stepped away. He should have, but he didn't. His stillness became its own decision. And in that charged silence, Michael understood the truth. Control was gone. Nothing between them, or at home, would ever return to what it had been before. It began so subtly that he could almost deny a tan extra smile. A lingering pause, a glance that carried meaning, but what was once harmless friendship turned into something far more dangerous. Their conversations shifted. No longer only about work or design, they drifted into late-night texts about loneliness, about what it felt like to carry silent disappointments. Michael found himself confiding in Emily about things he never voiced to soothe the pressure of his job, the fear of fading dreams, the hollow space he felt in his marriage. Emily listened, responded with warmth, and told him about her own struggles. Two hearts quietly aching had found each other, and that connection grew like fire in dry grass, silent at first, then unstoppable dot at home. Sarah felt the distance like a storm pressing against her windows. She asked fewer questions now, her attempts at closeness met with half-hearted smiles and distracted nods. The man she loved was still in front of her, but his spirit was elsewhere, unreachable. Shettried to fight the sinking fear that someone or something had taken his attention away. Michael, however, was caught between two worlds. He loved Sarah, or at least he told himself he did, but every time he was with Emily, a different side of him came alive. The side that laughed without effort, that felt young again, that believed someone truly saw him. He convinced himself it wasn't serious, that it was just a temporary escape from stress. Yet every message, every glance, every stolen moment told him the truth. This was more than escape. He was falling. One Friday evening, Sarah surprised him with news. She had booked a weekend getaway for the two of them, hoping time away from work would bring them closer again. "Just the two of us," she said, her eyes full of hope. Michael forced a smile, agreeing, though his heart twisted with guilt. He wanted to want this with her, but his mind was already clouded with thoughts of Emily. That same night, his phone buzzed with a message. "I miss you already." 5 words from Emily, but they carried more weight than Sarah's entire plan. He sat frozen in the living room, phone in hand, Sarah humming softly in the kitchen as she prepared their late dinner. The contrast between the two women crushed him. One was his wife, the partner who had built a life with him. The other was the woman who made him feel alive in ways he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it wasn't love, that he was just flattered by the attention, but the truth was harsher. His heart had begun to drift, and no excuse could change that. In the office, their secret grew heavier. They never spoke of it openly, but their eyes gave everything away. A casual brush of hands when passing papers, a pause that lasted too long, silence that said more than words. Every interaction deepened the unspoken bond. Michael felt both thrilled and terrified, torn between desire and conscience. Meanwhile, Sarah's hope dimmed with each passing day. She planned dinners, tried to share old jokes, suggested calling their friends for a night out. But Michael's enthusiasm never matched hers. The man who once held her with warmth now seemed distracted, as if living a life she no longer belonged to. She didn't know what had changed, but she knew something had. The breaking point came quietly. One evening, Michael stayed late again. Sarah, determined to reconnect, packed Asmal's bag of his favorite food and drove to his office. When she arrived, she found the lights dim and the building nearly empty. She walked the quiet halls, bag in hand, and paused when she saw Michael through the glass of his office. He was standing close to Emily, too close. They weren't touching, but the air between them spoke louder than any embrace. Sarah's heart dropped. She didn't enter. She didn't confront them. She walked back to her car, her hands trembling. The food she had prepared no wevy in her grip. She cried quietly the whole way home, unable to deny what her eyes had seen. When Michael arrived later that night, Sarah said nothing. She didn't ask where he had been, didn't question the tired excuse he gave, but something inside her shifted. Trust had cracked, and though she didn't yet have proof beyond her own instincts, she knew her marriage was no longer whole. Michael sensed it too. The silence at home became louder than any argument. He wanted to explain to tell her he was lost and confused, but guilt kept his lips sealed. He carried the weight of both women in his heart, Sarah, his wife, and Emily, the secret he couldn't let go of. Days blurred into nights, and the tension thickened. Every choice Michael made felt like betrayal. No matter which direction he turned, he told himself he could still fix it, that maybe he hadn't gone too far. But the truth was clear. The moment he allowed himself to slip, everything changed. The secret was no longer just his. It was written in Sarah's quiet eyes, in Emily's late-night words, in the ache that filled every room he walked into. His life had split, and there was no clean way back. Michael stood on the edge of a decision that would define everything. One step could keep his family together, the other could destroy it forever. And as he held his phone on late evening, staring at Emily's message glowing in the dark, he realized there was no escape from the truth. He had already gone too far. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when everything came undone. The house smelled of fresh coffee. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen table. And for a moment, it looked like an ordinary day. But Sarah's hands trembled as she held Michael's phone. She hadn't meant to look, hadn't planned on invading his privacy. But when the screen lit up with a message, her eyes fell on it before she could stop herself. "I miss you already." 5 words. That was all it took to break her world apart. Her chest tightened and she sat frozen, reading the message again and again. She didn't need more proof. Her heart had already known the truth for weeks. Now the words confirmed what her silence had been screaming. Michael was no longer hers alone. When Michael walked into the kitchen, he noticed her pale face, the phone clutched in her hand. The room felt heavier than air. Sarah's eyes met his, filled with hurt that no words could soften. She didn't raise her voice, didn't throw accusations. She simply asked, her voice quiet but steady. "How long?" Michael's mouth opened, but no answer came. His silence said everything. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze, shame burning through him. That silence was a confession more powerful than any words. Sarah set the phone on the table and stepped back. Her heart ached with a mix of anger and sorrow, but mostly it was disappointment. She had trusted him with everything, and now that trust was shattered. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall in front of him. The hours that followed passed like a storm. Michael tried to explain, stumbling through half-formed apologies, telling her he never meant for it to go so far, that it had been a mistake he couldn't control. But every word only cut deeper. Sarah didn't want excuses. She wanted the man she had married, the man who had once looked at her with devotion. That man, she realized, was gone. In the days after, The house was filled with silence. They moved around each other like strangers, speaking only when necessary. Sarah cried behind closed doors, her heart breaking in quiet pieces. Michael, consumed with guilt, replayed every choice that addled him here. Emily was gone, had quietly stepped out of his life once the truth surfaced. But her absence didn't undo the damage. The betrayal was already carved deep into the walls of his home. Sarah questioned everything now. Every late night at the office, every distracted smile, every cold moment at dinner. All of it had meaning she hadn't wanted to see. Trust, once broken, didn't mend easily. She looked at Michael and wondered if she had ever truly known him at all. Michael felt the weight of his mistake everywhere he went. At work, he kept his head down, avoiding Emily's empty desk. At home, he tried to reach for Sarah, but she pulled away, her eyes guarded. He had thought he could control the situation, that he could balance two worlds, but he had been wrong. A moment of weakness had unraveled years of love, and now he was left with the ruins. Nights were the hardest. Lying beside Sarah, he could feel the distance between them like a canyon. She no longer rested her head on his shoulder. She no longer whispered goodnight. The silence screamed louder than any argument. He wanted to hold her, to beg her forgiveness, but he knew words alone couldn't erase the pain. Weeks passed, but the wound remained raw. Friends noticed the change in them, the forced smiles, the tired eyes. Sarah avoided gatherings, unwilling to pretend. Michael worked longer hours, though not with the same energy, more as a way to escape the quiet house that no longer felt like home. One evening, Sarah finally spoke. They sat in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken truths. "Do you love her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's throat tightened. No, it wasn't love. It was a mistake. Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "But you loved the way she made you feel, and that's what hurts the most." Her words struck him harder than anger ever could. She was right. It hadn't been about love, but about the part of him that craved attention, excitement, validation, and in chasing that had destroyed the in-person who had loved him faithfully for years. From that night on, their marriage stood at a fragile crossroads. They spoke more honestly, but the honesty was painful. Sarah admitted her trust was broken. Michael admitted his shame was unbearable. They both knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Emily was gone from his life completely. A chapter closed, but her shadow lingered in every conversation, every silence, every attempt to heal. Michael thought often about the moment he had lost control, the second he chose not to step back, and how that single choice had changed everything. The story didn't end with a clean resolution. Some wounds never heal perfectly, and some choices leave scars that time cannot erase. For Sarah, the betrayal became a part of her history, something she carried like an invisible weight. For Michael, it became a reminder of how quickly trust can shatter and how fragile love truly is when taken for granted. Life moved forward, but nothing was ever the same again. The laughter they once shared felt distant. The warmth they once knew seemed unreachable. They lived under the same roof, but the innocence of their marriage was gone forever. Michael often sat alone at night, staring out the window, thinking about the man he had been before that rainy evening in the office. He longed to undo it, to turn back time, to choose differently. But life offered no rewinds, only lessons carved deep into the heart, and so it carried the weight of his mistake. Knowing that in one moment of lost control, he had altered the course of his life, his marriage, and his future. The world outside their home kept moving. Seasons changed, deadlines passed. The city buzzed with life. But inside, both Michael and Sarah knew the truth. Their story had shifted. Their love had been tested. And no matter how hard they tried, nothing could erase the fact that nothing was ever the same again.